So now we'll move into the journal publishing cycle, or as I like to call it, where did my paper go? Will I ever see it again? This is what the cycle basically looks like. We're going to start by talking about the submission and peer review processes. If you haven't already, you will soon run into one of what is really a very small number of online submission and peer review systems. It's helpful that there's so few of them sometimes, because it means that you get used to the quirks in one, because you've seen it over in another journal. You know what information it's going to ask for and when. You know when's a good time to go get a cup of coffee, because this is going to take a while while that thing churns in the background. They tend to not be very well liked, these types of review systems, because they ask a lot of questions. They're not necessarily the most efficient in some ways. When I started in publishing, we would receive manuscripts in triplicate in the mail. We would FedEx out copies of those manuscripts to potential peer reviewers who would fax us back their reviews, hopefully. And then we would type this all up into one nice letter, and we would mail it out to the author who had submitted those triplicates. I can tell you, this system is actually a lot more efficient and effective than that used to be. It allows you to turn around things quicker than you could. It also allows people to be engaged who maybe couldn't be in the past. So new researchers, researchers who are still forming their careers, researchers who have moved, researchers in certain parts of the world. So there's a lot of benefits to these systems, but at the same time, it is advised that you're aware of them, that you know what to expect when you go into them. There are still a surprising number of journals that will allow you to email your submission. This is very rare, so in most cases you're going to go through these systems. And once that paper is received, it's probably going to be processed by the editorial office, sent to an editor, who, if they decide that it's sufficiently within scope and meets certain other basic criteria for their journal, is going to send it out for peer review. A lot of journals try to be very mindful of their reviewers as a finite resource. If they don't think a paper has a significant chance of success within their journal, they might return it to you and say, thanks for inviting us to consider this. It's so far outside of our scope, I don't think it's going to work. Or there's a fatal flaw in this paper that makes it not fit with our needs or standards. Those tend to be quickly turned around. If you haven't heard anything within the first week or so, hopefully that's a positive sign that's moved on. And that's where we invite the external peer reviewers. So peer review, at its best, is supposed to help determine the quality, validity, significance, and originality of research. I'm sure we can all think of cases where peer review has not worked as intended, papers that have been published and then found to have significant mistakes or problems later. We don't think about the many, many papers and errors that were caught before they were published. So hopefully it is helping to improve the quality, but it's not an error-free process. Right? It's a human endeavor. These are people who are actually reading the papers, who are actually commenting on the papers. I highlighted originality here because one of the interesting changes that's happening is that some journals are trying to take that out of the equation. They're trying to not look at novelty as a standard because it discourages certain kinds of research. It discourages reproduction, reproducibility. It discourages maybe research that is not groundbreaking, but it's just a nice incremental advance, which is, after all, what so much of science is built on. So some of these journals, what they call the sound science journals, will look at it from that perspective. Other journals will look at it and say, is this sufficiently novel? Is this sufficiently, I don't want to say groundbreaking again, but does it move the field sufficiently to be published in our journal? It's a different philosophy. One's not necessarily inherently better or worse than the other, but it's good to know what to expect when you go into the process. There are different variations to peer review. This came up earlier. Most scientific and medical journals use what's called blind or single blind. This is where the reviewers know who the authors are, but the authors don't necessarily know who the reviewers are. And so you'll get your comments back, and it'll say comments from the editor, comments from reviewer 1, reviewer 2, and then reviewer 3. And there's all sorts of jokes about reviewer 3 and how they wreck everyone's lives because they're usually the tie-breaking vote that makes the decision. But that's the single blind version. Double blind says, well, you know, that's not really fair, right? Because that means that some of those biases that we talked about earlier, maybe that reviewer had a bias that wasn't declared, that wasn't detected. So maybe we make it double blind and we say, okay, we're not going to tell the reviewers who the authors are. They'll be judged purely on the work, which is great in theory. There's certainly been any number of cases of biases that have come up. Part of the challenge here is that if you look at the reference list of an article, you can sometimes suss out who the author was. If you work within a certain field, you can sometimes figure out who it was. Interestingly, there was a study a couple of years ago that looked at this phenomenon and found that reviewers weren't as good as figuring out who the author was as they thought they were. And similarly, authors aren't as good at figuring out the reviewers as they think they are. So there might be something there. The open peer review philosophy goes the opposite direction. It says, let's actually just open the whole thing up. Authors will know who the reviewers are. Reviewers will know who the authors are. Because the reviewers have to use their names, they won't say anything inappropriate. They'll be hopefully a little bit more constructive with their criticism. Of course, it does raise the question of if you're invited to review the work by some very prominent person in your field, perhaps a person upon whose decision your career might depend at some point, does that affect the type of comments you make? These are questions that have to be asked too. So all of these versions have different advantages or reasons to pause. Pre and post publication is another area where we're seeing a lot of experimentation. The traditional model is you review it and then you publish it. So we're thinking, okay, what if we put it out and then let people review it? You get more people who are able to review it. What you find there is, it's like with commenting, right? You put it out there and you get either no comments, or you get a lot of useless comments, or maybe you get a few actually helpful comments. So trying to find a balance there. When you get a decision back on your manuscript on first decision, it's going to probably be one of three different types. Rejection is by far the most common. You want to learn from the feedback provided, proof your work for a resubmission. Now, does this mean that you have to accept a rejection? Most journals will have some policy whereby you can rebut. You can contest a rejection decision. This has usually got to be based on one of two things. A gross misunderstanding of the science that you can prove. So if in 30 pages of comments they made one typo on page 19, you can't say, see, the reviewer doesn't know anything. You can't assess me based on that. If they consistently confuse B cells and T cells, maybe there's something there. So that's something to look for. If there's evidence that someone's misunderstanding of the science involved has affected their evaluation of your paper, there might be grounds. A provable bias, the hardest thing to do, because a lot of people don't come out and say, I'm biased against this group, or I'm biased against you. There was a case a couple of years ago with a paper, and I won't say it was Science, where the reviewer said, and this got through to the author, the reviewer said, maybe you should try resubmitting this paper with a male co-author. Yes, exactly. Obviously, a case to be made for appealing that decision based on a bias, right? And it was. It was effectively, well, it was tried by the court of social media first, and then so those are really the two main areas. Misunderstanding of the science or obvious and provable bias. Even so, there are some rules to rebutting a decision. Number one is wait 24 hours. Just general rule. I've seen some letters written. People would probably have taken back if they'd had those 24 hours. Cool down a little bit, think about it, and then see if you still want to contest it. Know that there's a good chance that the editor will share any comments with the reviewers to see if it changes their opinion. So no name calling, no questioning the reviewer's intelligence, because if you're not willing to say it to that person directly, you probably don't want to risk the chance that the editor is going to share it with them. And do respond to the major points, the critical points, as to why, and make your case as to why this is worthy of reconsideration. They don't have to honor the rebuttal, but it's something to be aware of. The next two types of decision are around revision. You might not know the difference. They're not going to necessarily come out and say, congratulations, you got a minor revision decision. But there is a difference. Minor revision is usually a good sign. It's stylistic things or rephrasing small, easily correctable parts of your manuscript. If you get that back, make those changes quickly and resubmit it while the interest is still there, while the editor, while the reviewers are still enthusiastic about your paper. If you wait for the maximum allowed time, you don't know what else might come out in the meantime. People's passion for your paper might cool a little bit, and they might see it a little bit differently in that time. So try and strike while the iron is hot, as they say. Major revision. You're going to get a lot of comments. Some of them will be structural. Some of them will be asking for more experiments. You want to answer the comments one by one and explain why you made the changes or not. And you don't have to make every change that's requested of you by a reviewer or editor. Editors will sometimes highlight which ones they think are critical, but if you don't make it, you need to be very clear as to why you did not make that. You want to submit that revised version. You want to make it clear where your changes have been made. So it's easy for the reviewer, because the reviewers already spend time on the paper. They're going to go look in. What you really want them to be able to do is just say, okay, what did I say last time? How has that been addressed? Am I comfortable with that? Great. And we can move on. If you make it hard for them to find where those changes are, it will negatively impact the review. People might go through the paper a little bit differently the second time. So you just want to try and make it as easy as possible for everyone involved. And know that acceptance is not guaranteed. Maybe there's something in your responses where the editor or reviewer says, oh, well, I hadn't realized that before, but now that you've answered it that way, I realize that there's this problem with the paper. Or maybe they're not convinced by the responses you gave. So do give it your honest shot. And really, editors try not to reject manuscripts after they've already received that first round of revision. And certainly, they don't want to keep a process going any longer than necessary for authors. Any more comments on peer review before I move on?
I would just make a general comment that reviewers of these manuscripts, they're doing this on a volunteer basis, and they're busy. So, a lot of them will often look for the fatal flaw just to get it off their desk. And so that just sort of gets to the point at, before you submit your project to the IRB or whatever you're doing, spend enough time ahead of time thinking about it and, meeting with a librarian and going through that really complete literature search and meeting with a statistician to go through the methodology so that you don't do all of this work and then have some reviewer just, kill it because of a fatal flaw that you missed.
Yeah. Very true.
And I'll just add that really, really carefully read the reviewer comments and really respond to them, because there is nothing that upsets them more than for them to tell you exactly what they want you to do and you don't do it. That's a good way to get it rejected after 1 or 2 rounds of review.
Yep.
Just a question for you, George. Dr. Chang brought up the IRB, and we've seen instances where this has come up. Can you comment about the trend towards more strict expectations around IRB approval and documentation upstream of work being conducted, as we've seen some disappointment in situations?
Sure. And that, to some degree, that will go back to the ethical part as well. There is the idea that you want to make sure you've obtained those approvals up front. We do see some papers sometimes where people will say, I'm surprised this got IRB approved. And having that stamp, having that approval that your research has gone through that is critical, particularly as the fields diversify, as we pull in more people from different parts of the world where IRBs are evaluating things a little bit differently. There's really a challenge to have each community cohere its values, to cohere its ideas around that. As you probably know, one of the topics that people in publishing have been struggling with a little bit recently now is the whole gene editing situation from earlier this year. And the research was done. Does it now get published so that it can be put out there so that it can be evaluated? Or does the fact that it went through some questionable approval policy or approaches mean that it should not be put out there through a formal journal at all? So I think that these are probably questions we're going to see increasing, and that's one of the reasons why you're starting to see those questions coming from editors, from reviewers earlier in that process, trying to make sure that really this has been vetted from that perspective.
Follow-up question for you, which comes up very frequently, is work that started in the clinical realm, work that started in a quality improvement setting and was not meant for publication but was done for PDSA improvement cycles, then has a finding that's important, and the group wishes to now move forward with publication. Different journals respond differently in terms of the lack of IRB pre-processing and review and approval.
Yeah, and I think one of my messages today is that there are people involved with journals. I mean, it seems like something so obvious, but there's different philosophies, there's different approaches there. So we talked a little bit about some of the general rules that most editors will follow, but you are going to find some variation because it's a subjective decision in a lot of ways. It's not necessarily a hard and fast rule, like so many of these things. Right? For plagiarism, plagiarism is more than this many words. It's really a subjective evaluation. So in cases like that where there is no hard and fast rule, you do find editors making a decision on a case-by-case basis. And that's why a group like COPE, which is cross-publisher, cross-journal, can be helpful because they can provide at least guidance based on what people have done in the past. They can share expert recommendations, but that's all it's going to be, is just a recommendation, just guidance, unless there's a law that gets passed, unless something becomes accepted practice. You are going to see that variation. So we're going to talk about what happens after you've been accepted. In the good old days, in the old days, you had basically two versions of your manuscript. You had the final published version, and then you had that original version that you'd written out in cursive or typed on a typewriter somewhere. Because of technology, we now have the ability to create multiple stages of an article and to publicly share any or all of these stages of an article. So I want to talk a little bit about these because they do have a few ramifications. Preprints is the version probably before you've submitted to a journal. Sometimes it's the version that you submit to the journal, ideally. And it can be shared in any number of ways. A lot of journals are moving in this direction, and I think within health and science, within health and medical sciences, I should say, there's some evolving thoughts here. Because obviously you need to be careful about releasing information that hasn't been vetted appropriately, but there's still a push to think about how can we get information out there earlier, expose it to that vetting in a safe, controlled way. There's a new preprint server called medRxiv that's launched that is looking at exactly these kinds of questions, trying to follow up on the success that we've seen in arXiv over in physics, certain areas of physics, bioRxiv in the biological sciences, and basically it's the idea of being able to publicly share this version of your manuscript before we're at the point of submission. Once the paper's gone through the review process, there's now an accepted version of the manuscript, whatever you submitted for the final round of review that's been accepted. And this one's important because a lot of journals, in trying to speed up communication of science, are now making this version publicly available. And they say, okay, it's been through the review process, we can put it out there, share it with the world. And the trick here is that one of the things I've found personally, at least, is that if there's any good way to find that you've misspelled a co-author's name, it's to submit to one of these journals. Because that is by far the largest question or concern I get for people who've had their accepted version posted online is, whoops, I completely misspelled my co-author's name. How do I fix that? And at the point it's out there publicly, maybe it's been picked up by PubMed already, so there's some certain amount of disentanglement that needs to be done. So my message here is just a call to you to make sure that if you're submitting a revised manuscript or any manuscript really, make sure that you have given it that extra read to try to catch those embarrassing mistakes. I had one about a month ago now. The person had misspelled their own name. And were very concerned when they did a PubMed search and it wasn't showing up, and then they looked at it and realized, whoops, I forgot that letter. So make sure that you've done that extra read, that you've caught anything. It will get fixed, it will get corrected as the time goes on, as later versions of the article become available, but you really want to try and minimize the chances of that happening. At some point you'll receive a proof, and this will be when the typesetter and the copy editor have worked their magic on the paper and have hopefully done more good than harm, and you can go in and take a look and think about, okay, is that really how I want it to look? Do I have any final refinements here? Now, what's important about the proof stage is that at this point you should be just really correcting any things that you might have missed before and just reviewing to make sure that everything really does look good. This is not the time to be adding authors. This is not the time to be adding whole new sections to your paper, because all those things require a paper to go back to that editor, potentially to the reviewers, to see if this changes how that manuscript is received. So really it's for corrections at this point. And then you've got the final published version of the article. Yes?
Does anyone ever proof a mobile-friendly version of the article? Look at how that layout is.
Good question. So she was asking if anyone ever proofs a mobile-friendly version of the article. So most of the ones I have experience with, what you're proofing is the PDF, right? It's not. I haven't seen a journal yet where you proof the HTML in the way that you're describing, so that you would see how the responsive design aspects of it, how it would go. I think that I wouldn't be surprised if we see that coming. Already, certainly, I could talk about at our company, we're moving towards more of an HTML-based proofing process, where you're making sure the content is right, and then it'll be fed into any number of different ways. But I think it's a very good question, but so far I'm not aware of any. And I don't see anyone rushing to correct me. So good, good. Any other questions at this point?